Hi everyone, it's Ben here. I'm just going to quickly show you a really simple way of doing data visualization models. And this is probably too simple for a lot of you, but I just want to show you where you can start with this process, how quickly you can get the data, convert it into something that can be either visual or physical, and then that hopefully will serve as a starting point for a lot of you. So the type of model I'm going to show you guys is this one here, which is essentially a graph that's been given 3D properties. Now you can see this one's a little simple, doesn't really give much detail. So when you look at it, it's really hard to actually gain any information from it. You can see there are these different graphs and they relate to each other, but you don't know what's what. There's very little relationship between the two. So without someone explaining it, it doesn't really stand up on its own. But there are better examples of that. So one of those is this project by Evandro Damiel, and it's an interactive graph where there's a screen set up down the bottom with some simple coding done with Arduino, I think. And essentially once you click on a little prompt, it'll light up the graph in different ways. And that'll mean that you can see information that responds to that prompt, which is really interesting. It means that now the data starts to have information attached to it. So it starts to have more of a narrative purpose, which is really important for your graduation studio and your research studio, because you're finding a lot of data to support your design proposal and your design direction. So this is great for that. Another way of doing it is sort of more in an artistic sense, using visual tools. So this one about the declining coral reefs uses sort of 3D models juxtaposed against the graph to show a relationship. So that's sort of, again, get into a more poetic narrative style model rather than something that's dry like this first one. With that in mind, one of the reasons I started thinking about doing a model like this and some of the data that I was interested in was based on the recent Pritzker Prize award to Grafton Architects, which most of you, hopefully all of you, will have heard about. And the thing that interested me the most about that is thinking about the fact that I'd seldom heard of Grafton Architects before this. And then just wondering how that sort of played out in terms of the data set. So one way that's really easy to find data, especially if you're looking for big, broad concepts or general overviews, is looking at Google Trends. So Google Trends is just that. It lists out all the trends in search patterns over whatever period you choose. So in this case, it's 12 months, and the parameters are worldwide. You can go ahead and change it for anything. So you could sort of localize it, look at Australian search terms, and this could be something that looks at sort of aspirational or bigger picture things. It could be something that looks at fear based around bushfire searches or even searches now that relate to coronavirus, and sort of juxtapose those to see the way people are feeling about them. And it also gives you this option of adding comparisons. So I added the Pritzker Prize as one of my search terms and Grafton Architects, and it gives you this overlay so you can see that the difference in how much they normally search for. So unsurprisingly, there's a peak for both searches just about the time of the Pritzker Prize nomination. But before that, there's a general sort of principle where the data for the Pritzker Prize is tracking to be more substantial than that of Grafton Architects, except for this moment right here. So at the beginning of October. And I think the great thing about looking at Google Trends like this is it lets you look at patterns, and then you get to sort of try to unpick them and see why that might be. So this one is fairly simple, but a lot of you might not have heard of it before. So in, I think, early October, Grafton Architects were awarded the 2020 REBA Royal Gold Medal, so which acts as sort of a precursor to the Pritzker Prize or the case. But that's, again, not something I knew initially. But because of this research looking at the trends, I could go back and I could find the reason for that change in the pattern. So a good thing about Google Trends is it puts things in a map. Does it graphs it? It'll do it by area, by region breakdown. It'll have related queries, so things that come up, the regions where it's interested. There's a lot of different data you can get from it. But what you can also do is you can download this data. So it's easily downloadable. It comes out as a CSV, and then you can choose to map that in Excel if you want, or sort of go ahead and use that to extrude another graph. But these are pretty general, so they're not always going to be relevant to your really specific and nuanced design questions. So another website that we think is really great for finding data is ID Community. So it's a Sydney-based community profile, and you go on there and it gives you huge breakdowns of all the data based on the census. And what's really good about it is that it relates it to a map. So you can go through and change it based on diversity, so the amount of people who cycle to work, medium density, high density housing, and that'll change the way it relates to this map. So the map will then update to show you the extent of people. Here we see that 8.2% of people living in this area cycle to work, which now we're getting to much more specific data, which can help you formulate your design question. It also gives you population data, so getting away from graphical things to forecasts, so looking at current trends and then future growth. And then it also has an economic profile, which is the one we're going to look at quickly now, mainly just because it comes out in graphs, which makes it a lot easier to have a look at. So here, this one, it's the gross regional product of Sydney, the city of Sydney, versus the rest of New South Wales. Which could be relevant, but I'm going to change it to sort of put it against the rest of Australia for that data set. You can see it's a slightly updated graph, sort of a similar looking thing. What you can do here is you can export it. You can export it as a PNG, SVG, or PDF. I normally recommend an SVG because it's all completely editable when you bring it into Illustrator. So if I go to Illustrator now, I can look, you'll come up with something that looks a little bit like this. What that means is then you can start to edit and delete and change things as you need them. So removing grid lines, getting it down, whatever you want. And so I use that information to produce these, just these current blocks that come together and they sort of represent the data as a physical form that could be laser cut really quickly. Obviously remembering that to laser cut, you're changing it to 0.001, and it's going to be a red stroke. So there's a lot of sort of things you might want to change there, but it does give you a really good base. And in the end, you end up getting something that looks a little bit like this. Now, this is obviously super simple. It's probably not enough data sets to make it sort of meaningful or interesting, but it then does give you something you can visualize as a model. So when you're talking about the relationship between these two areas, so we have the medium one, which is that square profile in the center, and we have City of Sydney and Australia sort of represented there, and we can see that the peaks and the ebbs are mostly the same, but we might then choose to find these data points where that correlation doesn't line up and use that as a way for greater research into areas and just sort of find a causal link, which gives us like greater depth when we're thinking about a research question. It's not just looking at one set of data that says the city of Sydney has excellent GDP, rather it's saying that there's a story that goes on with all of this, and these data visualizations or physicalizations, this is a great tool not only for you to realize that, but also to communicate that to other people. If you were going to do one like this, I would expect it to be much larger, more complex, graphically more interesting, but this is just a really simple way of doing it. And you could, again, lay it up as one model and slice it using Slicer like we talked about last time, or just cut it individually and assemble it. If you are going to do that, think about material, the best way to convey it. Think about that original timber one, which was so dense you couldn't see through it. Really, a lot of the data was lost. Is it done in different shades of perspex? Are they staggered so you can put information around them? Do you have a graphical component that sort of starts to augment this so it becomes a more interesting piece to really communicate what you're doing? This whole thing is a tool for you guys to say, this is what I've been researching, so what I'm interested in. Here's my unique take on it. And here's where I'm going to further that research for the rest of the term. This has just been a really simple one. There'll be a couple of others that show you a more complex process using softwares like Grasshopper, Rhino, and other things, but I just thought I'd start really quick and simple. So cheers.